Chapter 7 of True Tales of Arctic Heroism in the New World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark Ernest. True Tales of Arctic Heroism in the New World by Adolphus W. Greely. How Woon Won Promotion. Poor, reckless, rude, low-born, untaught, a heart with English instinct fraught, he only knows that not through him shall England come to shame. Doyle. This tale recites one of the many stirring experiences of the crew of Her Majesty's ship Investigator, which, after having been frozen fast in the ice floes of Mercy Bay, Banksland, for 2 years, was abandoned June 3, 1853. Owing to lack of provisions, the men, living on 2/3 rations for 20 months, were obliged to keep the field for hunting purposes so as to avoid death by starvation. The incidents herein related occurred in connection with the chase. The sun had been entirely absent for 94 days, and the coldest period of the winter was at hand. Even at the warmest moment of the midwinter month, February, the temperature had barely risen to 0. At times the mercury froze solid, and the cold was so intense that even the ship herself seemed to suffer as much as the half-starved, ill-clad men. The metal bolts and rivets glared at one with their ice-covered ends, while the wooden tree-nails, timbers, and doors cracked continually under the twin action of frost and contraction. And so, since the New Year's coming, the crew had shielded themselves as best they could from the utter darkness of the land and the frightful cold of the air. Even when it was possible, hunting was unfruitful of results. The deer had migrated to the pastures of the milder south, while the hares and small game had huddled in crannies and nooks for shelter against the wind. But now a few hours of feeble twilight, steadily increasing in duration and in brightness, were marked by broad bands of life-giving light at midday in the southern sky. Though the longer days were those of sharper cold, yet hunger and want early drove the hunters from the ship. As soon as there was enough glimmering light to make it possible, the keen-eyed sportsmen started inland to find and follow the trails of such animals as might yet be in the country. At the same time they were charged to take the utmost care to make sharp note of prominent landmarks by which they could safely take up their return march to the Investigator. The spring hunt may be said to have fairly opened 10 days before the return of the long-absent sun, when a wretchedly gaunt reindeer was killed on January 28, 1852. For days individual deer had been seen, evidently returned from the south, where their winter life must have been a constant struggle against starvation, judging from the slain animal. While the deer of the previous autumn were always in good flesh, there was in this case not a bit of fat on any rib. A collection of mere skin and bones, this deer weighed less than 90 pounds, and the same as a large wolf or draft dog. This early success stimulated to action the hungry hunters, who thenceforth let no day pass without ranging the distant hills for sign of deer or musk ox, anxious for the hunter's perquisites, the longed-for head and heart of the game. On February 9th the day broke calm, clear, and unusually bright, especially attractive because of an hour of sunlight, the sun having come above the horizon at midday 4 days earlier. Every man who could get permission was enticed into the field, and great was the furore when one party brought in a small deer, giving promise of more from the hunters still in the open. With the passing hours, one man after another reached the ship, while the slowly vanishing twilight became fainter and fainter. When the darkness of night had come and the officer of the deck had checked off the hunters, he reported to the captain that 2 men were yet absent, Sergeant John Woon and Seaman Charles Anderson, both excellent men, active-bodied, and distinguished as hunters. Woon was the non-commissioned officer in charge of the detachment of Royal Marines, whose standing and popularity were almost as high with the seamen as with his own corps. Dr. Armstrong says of him, "He proved himself invaluable, was always a ready volunteer, most correct and soldier-like in conduct, ever contributed to the hilarity and cheerfulness of the crew, and was brave and intrepid on every occasion which fully tested the man. Whether on shipboard or on land, Woon never failed to do a lion's share of the work in hand, and was always the first to cheer and help a tired comrade. An indefatigable and successful hunter, he was familiar with the white wolves that so menace the safety of individuals. On one occasion, going for a deer shot that day, he killed at a distance of 100 yards a gaunt wolf who was greedily devouring the precious carcass. This monster wolf, with a thick coat of pure, unstained white, weighed 80 pounds, was 3 feet 4 inches high and 5 feet 10 inches in length. It was Sergeant Woon also who had distinguished himself in killing, under thrilling circumstances, 2 infuriated and charging musk oxen, as elsewhere related in the sketch Pym's Timely Sledge Journey. Altogether he was a man quite able to care for himself, though not coming to the ship with such a reputation for woodcraft, hunting skill, and physical activity as had Seaman Anderson. Able Seaman Charles Anderson was a man of powerful build and great muscular strength, who had made himself a leader among the seamen by his success in athletic sports, in which he easily excelled any other man on the ship. A Canadian by birth, his color and his personality disclosed in his veins deep strains of Indian or other alien blood. Inured to the hardships and labors of a hunter's life in the Hudson Bay Territory, where he claimed to have been an employee, he displayed in his social relations the mercurial and attractive qualities which distinguished the French half-breeds, the famous coeur de bois. At the evening meal there was more or less chaffing between the Marines and the seamen as to where were Woon and Anderson and what success they were having in the field. With a trace of that special pride of corps which goes so far to make the various arms of the military services so efficient, the seamen said that it was a pity that the absent men were not together so that Woon's safety might be better assured by the skill and strength of his friend Anderson. To these jests the Royal Marines answered, as was their wont, in kind, enlarging ludicrously by side remarks and flings on the reputed helplessness of sailors on land, especially on Deerback. At 8 o'clock that night affairs took a different turn, when it was known that McClure and the other officers felt serious alarm over the continued absence of 2 hunters who were said to be in the field apart. The fog had given place to a bright sky, with feeble light and rapidly falling temperature, so that disaster to one or both was thought to be probable. The presence and boldness of the prowling bands of ravenous wolves in the immediate neighborhood of the ship was viewed as one of the greatest dangers to a single disabled man. To show the location of the ship, and to guide the absentees to it in the darkness of the night, a mortar was first fired to attract the notice of the hunters, and then every 10 or 15 minutes a rocket was sent up. But with the closest attention no one could detect any sound that at all resembled a human voice. Nothing could be heard save now and then the ominous howling of wolves, doleful sounds to the anxious crew. After 2 disquieting hours of signals by mortar and rockets, with no responsive answers from the hunters, Captain McClure sent out 3 search parties, each headed by an officer. Arranging a code of signals both for recall to and for assistance from the ship, they set forth on an agreed plan in different directions, each party provided with rockets, blue light, food, wraps, and stimulants. In less than a quarter of an hour one of the searching parties met Sergeant Woon coming to the ship for help. Summoning another squad to join them, they hastened under the direction of Sergeant Woon to the relief of Anderson, who was perishing of cold in a snowdrift a scant mile distant. It appears that Anderson, discovering a herd of deer, had pursued and wounded one of them, which fled inland away from the ship. Following fast after the wounded animal, without noting the winding direction of the trail, he at length not only lost the tracks of the deer, but also found that the country was being covered by a light fog. Climbing the nearest hilltop, he was panic-stricken to find himself unable to note either the face of the bright southern sky, the hunter's usual method of finding their bearings, or to see any landmark that was at all familiar. He hurried from hilltop to hilltop, exhausting his strength, confusing his mind, and destroying his faith in his ability to find his homeward way. In utter despair he sat down in the snow and gave himself up for lost. Most fortunately, Sergeant Woon had seen no game, and chancing to cross the trail of Anderson and of the escaping deer, he decided to follow it up and help the sailor bring in his game. With extreme astonishment he found Anderson in a state of utter helplessness, already benumbed and certain soon to perish either from wolves or by freezing. Cold, fear, and fatigue had caused the seaman to lose not alone his powers of action and of decision, but had almost deprived him of the faculty of speech. He was in such a demoralized condition, half delirious, frightened, fatigued, and frosted, that he could not at first fully realize that his comrade had come to his assistance and that his ultimate safety was quite assured. His utter prostration was only known when Woon asked him to get up and go home, to which he feebly moaned out, "I am lost," and did not rise even when the sergeant curtly said, "Get up like a man, and you are all right." Some time passed before either words of cheer or sharp words of order and abuse had any effect. His patience worn out at last, Woon seized him roughly, dragged him to his feet, gave him a shove shipward, and started him on the home trail. But in a few minutes the bewildered seaman fell down in the deep snow through which he was walking. Not only was his strength worn out to exhaustion, but to the intense horror of Woon he was no sooner put on his feet than he fell down in a convulsive fit, while blood gushed freely from his mouth and nostrils. The appalling conditions would have shaken any man less courageous than this heroic sergeant. They were many miles from the Investigator. The weather was turning cold with the vanishing fog, and the feeble twilight — it was now about 2 o'clock in the afternoon — was giving way to coming darkness. If he went to the ship for aid, Anderson would surely perish before it could be obtained. In the hours of travel to and fro, the seaman would either freeze solidly or meet a horrible alternative fate from the not far distant wolves, whose dismal howlings already seemed a funeral dirge to their helpless prey. The audacity and strength of these starving, ravenous animals had been a constant source of anxiety and alarm to all the hunters. Especially had the forecastle talk run on one gigantic brute, standing nearly 4 feet high at the shoulder, leaving a footprint as big as that of a reindeer, who was thought to be the recognized leader of a marauding band from whose ravages no slaughtered game was free. If the seaman could not be left, neither could he be carried, for Anderson was one of the largest and heaviest men of the crew, while the marine was one of the smallest and lightest. At last the thought came to Woon that he could drag the seaman into the ship. Not daring, for fear of the wolves, to quit his gun, he slung both muskets across his shoulders and, clasping Anderson's arm around his neck, started to drag him in this manner through miles of snow to the ship. Such a task was of the most Herculean and exhausting character. The only relief that he had was when the trail brought him to the top of a hill or the edge of a ravine. Stopping and laying Anderson on the snow, he rolled him down the hillside to the bottom, in this way giving himself a rest and at the same time stirring the dormant blood and breaking the lethargic sleep of the steadily freezing seaman. In fact, this rough treatment was the saving of Anderson, as a fresh wind had sprung up with the temperature 57 degrees below the freezing point. For 10 long hours this heroic sergeant struggled on, while the situation seemed more and more critical. The seaman was growing stupider, while his own strength was decreasing from hour to hour, although his courage was unfailing despite cold, darkness, and snow. At length, when within a mile of the ship, he felt that he could not drag his man a step farther. While resting and planning what next to do, he saw a rocket shoot up, leaving its train of welcome, blazing light. Pointing to it, he called on Anderson to stand up and walk on as he was now safe. Again and again he uttered such words of cheer, with alternate threats and orders, but alas, without avail. The seaman only asked in feeble voice to be left alone to die, having reached that benumbed state so dangerous to a freezing man. Seeing that he could get him no farther, Woon laid him down in a drift of snow, covered him with such of his own clothing as he felt he could spare, and throwing quite a thick coating of snow over him so as in a measure to protect him from the awful cold, went ahead for aid, which most happily proved to be near at hand. The precautions that the sergeant had taken on leaving the man saved his life, as a half-hour's longer exposure to the extreme cold would have proved fatal. As it was, Anderson was brought to the ship insensible, with his heart scarcely beating, with clenched frozen hands, rigid limbs, glassy eyes, and hard-set jaws. He lost parts of both feet, of both hands, and of his nose by amputation, but with his robust constitution recovered his general health and returned safely to England. The courage and devotion of Woon was recognized by his promotion to be color sergeant, the highest grade to which Captain McClure could advance him. Welcome as was this increase of rank to Woon, it stood second in his mind to a sense of the high honor and deeper regard with which he was ever after held by the men of the ship. All felt that to his strength of will, powers of endurance, and heroic spirit of comradeship was due the life of the ship's favorite, first from death by exhaustion and exposure, and then from a more horrible fate at the ravenous jaws of the greatly feared wolves. In after time, when, in the midst of a heated argument as to service matters, some exultant marine would refer to the story of the big seaman and the little sergeant, with a modesty equal to his courage and creditable to his spirit of comradeship, Color Sergeant Woon would at once interrupt the speaker and change the subject of conversation. Nor is Woon's heroism an especially unusual episode in the thrilling history of Arctic service. In countless and too often unrecorded cases, not only the officers, but especially also the rank and file, have practically and gloriously illustrated by personal heroism those splendid qualities of uplifted humanity, fortitude, loyalty, patience, best of all, solidarity and the spirit of self-sacrifice. These unheralded and humble heroes have at the call of duty, as circumstances required, done their part each in his own way. Among these the name of Color Sergeant Woon stands high, simply because his rising to a noble occasion is a matter of written record. We know not his later career in war or in peace, but we feel sure that as color sergeant he lived up to the ideal of an American private when, as others of his caste, for the honor and safety of a nation, he shows in a nameless skirmish how the color guard can die. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Mark Ernest.